Hello friends of the Son of Assistant Reading. We want to talk today about realism and anti-realism, and I found here this interesting graphic. Actually, I know that for quite some time, and it distinguishes between realism and anti-realism and what they are about. So I really like this graphics because it tells us a lot about how they function. For example, a realism is metaphysically ambitious, while the more we go into the direction of anti-realism, we actually try to eliminate metaphysics. So it's an interesting graphic that I recommend. And why is that important? Well, we all know like the attempts to understand how we look at the world, and then somebody says, I'm an optimist, another one says I'm a pessimist. And I know when I was in the 6th grade and in my English classes, we were discussing this topic, and the teacher was asking everyone, I put in my mind, yeah, I'm going to answer, I'm neither of them. I'm a realist because I look at things as they really are. And this thought is now embarrassing to me, even that was in the 6th grade. So I was probably something like 11 to 12 years old. But even the more embarrassing is it that some people think, like at their age of 20, 25, 30, or even 40, that they are realists. And one of them is certainly Ben Shapiro, that a lot of people admire because he destroys other people only with reason and logic and rationality, right? And it's distrust of government isn't baseless cynicism, it's realism. And somehow some people always claim that they know the reality better than anyone else. Now, why is that important? Because I want to read today the book of Hilary Lawson, which is called Closure, A Story of Everything. And if you look into the book, he actually attacks realism. So in the new relative postmodern area, there is no unique history, no agreed morality, and no uncontested knowledge. He gives some example. We have chaos theory, strength theory, fuzzy logic, and so on and so forth. So the major idea is that nowadays we just don't know what reality is anymore. And a lot of people, they hint to the consequence, well, if you say we don't know what reality is, then how can we have morals? Well, not my problem, right? Either you show me that reality is, and you deduce a logic, a kind of more system of morality from that, or you have no morality if that is your claim. I mean, I think we can have systems of moral without a privileged access to reality, but just because we couldn't have a system of moral doesn't mean we have access to reality, right? So I hope you understand my argument here. And actually, Hilary Lawson, he recommends a different approach than to our systems of knowledge that is not based on a realist interpretation, but on a non-realist interpretation, which he distinguishes from anti-realism. And he says closure proposes that we regard the world as open, and it is we who close it through our histories. Nevertheless, he is also critical of the system of closure, as the theory of knowledge closure has dramatic consequences for our understanding of the sciences, changing what we think science does and how it is able to do it. It also accounts for why we need and desire both art and religion. It reshapes our understanding of ourselves and the organization of society, our goals, and our capacity to achieve them. But above all, it makes sense of where and who we are. Nevertheless, I said he includes some criticism, and it actually comes later in the book. And there he writes, closure proposes that we regard the world as open, and it is we who close it through our stories. One way to understand the story of closure is to see it as a description of a process that underlies experience, the behavior of individuals, and the operation of society. This process, the process of closure, is the means by which we are able to identify things from the flux of the world and thereby create a reality which we can understand and manipulate. I will argue that it is the process of closure that makes consciousness and language possible, drives human endeavors, and determines the way we intervene in the world. Seen in this light, the story of closure offers a theory about the operation of the human organism both individually and collectively. Now, a little bit further he actually says, and I didn't find that before, yet although these descriptions are appropriate, they are also misleading. For the story of closure is one that requires us to abandon such terms as reality, language, and the world in favor of a new terminology. These new terms allow us to escape the deep-seated paradoxes of the present in which we are currently enmeshed. So he actually thinks that as soon as we introduce metaphysical concepts as reality, language, and world, we open a box of paradoxes that won't let us address the world in the right way. So I'm not sure if that is the right way to avoid terms like reality and so on and so forth, and then use a theory of openness, but that's what we have to look into closer. So let's look a little bit closer into what he calls the history of a mistake. I will argue that the framework of contemporary thought is not only undesirable, but is enmeshed in a predicament so insistent and destructive that it is not sustainable at all. So what's the problem here? It is found in our acceptance of the perspectival and well, that's not our problem. The cutting edge of the predicament has been apparent in the writings of philosophers, but initial signs of this destructive force can be found throughout our culture. It is found in our acceptance of the perspectival and relative character of our knowledge and beliefs, and at the same time our refusal to accept the consequences of this recognition. This is actually a very interesting thought, because he claims somehow we know that we are deeply involved in a problem, but we don't want to carry the consequences, right? This is what a right-wing parent would say. Well, you know, like you need to learn in life that actions have consequences, so therefore you deserve a good beating. Anyway, in, for example, our desire to uphold moral behavior despite our acceptance that others adhere to different moral codes, and our desire to believe that science might uncover the ultimate laws of the universe, and yet our suspicion that science is not itself value-free, in our recognition that there are as many histories as there are point of views, yet our conviction that certain events cannot be denied as having taken place. And what I see very often is that these right-wing people that somehow reject the postmodern consequences, and again, not all left-wing people follow the postmodern idea, namely that there is a variety of perspectives. And I also don't know whether it's good to follow this idea, right? But a lot of the right-wing people that I actually observe, they usually adhere to a story of reason. They try to reject science and they say, is that really reasonable? Let's use reason because these scientists, they don't use reason and we shouldn't trust them. You should use your own mind, right? So, but in these systems of reason, there's embedded a flaw that has its mathematical counterpart in Gödel's theorem and its scientific counterpart in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory. So the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory basically means that an understanding of the world is fundamentally linked to someone's perspective. And perspectives actually may change the way the world is. I mean, I don't want to say they change it, but we cannot be sure that we are really dealing with a stable reality. And this is the problem here. And Gödel just shows that a completeness of math is basically impossible by the way math is configured itself, right? So, and this is what he understands the contemporary predicament, the circle of self-reference in which contemporary thought has been increasingly enmeshed, typified by rhetorical self-denials, and the use of inverted commas is not sustainable. So I have to take care of my dog here. Anyway, so a lot of people try to solve the so-called problem of self-reference. The problem of self-reference are sentences like, all Germans are liars, right? And I'm a German, so how can I say that? They are liars and they always lie. So obviously I couldn't say that. It's like a self-reference that is here. Or also something like this sentence is not true, or there is no truth. There's always a paradox, and then some people say that we have to forbid these sentences, but this seems to be an arbitrary prohibition in science and is not rationally motivated itself. And so he discusses these problems here because they have consequences for the way of how we can do a complete science. Truth in the sense of the possibility of a correct description of an independent reality has had a good innings, but its time is over. And the problem is that we have become unable to express what we seemingly wish to say, with the results that it is no longer apparent what could be said at all. And this is a problem of science. Like, if it cannot predict what it's going to say, what makes it in the end scientific, as it wants to predict the future? Now, we may limit our science to a very restrictive realm, right? But then also the claim of science would be lost, and maybe we would open the door to magical thinking. So, and with the increasing recognition of the importance of context, which for example is pragmatism, we see the retreat from facts. And of course, this is a problem in itself, right? Because suddenly the question is, what is a fact to actually underlie, for example, a political interpretation of a situation? And I mean, if you talk with Russians nowadays, you will be surprised how they think that they are fighting a just war, defending themselves against somebody who has built a huge gun in their backyard, and they are just going there to prevent Russia being attacked, right? And so the reconstruction of facts is largely dependent on context. The question is, how can we find contexts that are valid for us all? Maybe that's impossible. And of course, this is a task of philosophers who want to overcome this problem, right? And G. Moore, for example, proposed the existence of moral facts, but in the analytic or English-speaking tradition, it was not long before the notion of moral facts began to look anachronistic. In what can be regarded as an attempt to maintain the sanctity of facts, there were those who sought to identify a strict distinction between facts and values, a distinction which left matters of morality, aesthetics, and religion beyond the reach of truth and falsity. So what they actually did then was to say, well, let's first figure out what we are doing empirically with the world before we come to more complicated questions. Nevertheless, the boundaries of relativism seem to be endless, and even though it was wrong, the examples of the Hopi Indians and so on, they undermined the foundation of a stable kind of scientific empiricism. Over the next few decades, the advance, and Moore was like, I believe, around 1910, 1920, over the next few decades, the advance of relativism became more apparent, and with the arrival of Kuhn's account of scientific paradigms, the case can be made that the way was open not only for the theories of science to look uncertain, but also for the facts and observations on which they rested to be placed in jeopardy. Since then, it would appear that the relativist moment has been unstoppable. Now we can jump in and say, well, relativism is not logical. It begs the question, and it is dogmatic, and it is self-refuting, right? And this is a usual response here, because we say, well, you claim there is no truth at all. Lawson is actually aware of that problem, and he's not tapping into this trap. He just says, look, where can you finally come with your realist arguments? It's probably impossible, so why not think about a more pragmatic solution instead of claiming an extraordinary access to reality? And so, yeah, in that regard, the question is, if you can destroy my position with logical thinking and reason alone, I would be happy if you can recruit Ben Shapiro for that. But I have to say, the position in philosophy where a lot of intelligent people are thinking, it wouldn't look too much like the situation does not look as if it is much in your favor. I think the realist accounts have not been successful. And even in logic, we now see, for example, the acknowledgement that there are logical systems that allow for example, for the fact that the principle of non-contradiction is not always true. Anyway, this is what I wanted to talk about today about realism and relativism. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope we can discuss about this topic more in the future.